All right. Good morning and welcome. We're continuing our study of the book of Daniel. We're now in our sixth session, looking at Daniel chapter 5 today. This is the story of the famous writing on the wall. And of course, there's a kind of colloquial expression about, reading the writing that's on the wall. That's based off of the events in this particular story. And the story is very similar to a lot of the stories that we've already seen in the book of Daniel, to where we clearly have a king that is acting in a way that is defiant to the true God. He's acting in a way that's very prideful. And in light of his pride, God punishes him and God removes him from his position and gives it to somebody else. And in the midst of it, Daniel kind of comes in as this faithful person of God, this prophetic figure, and he speaks truth to the king, even though it's in a culture to where if you talk in the way kind of that Daniel does to the king, you could potentially be killed for doing so. So we have one character that functions as kind of an example of how you're not supposed to behave, and then we have another character that functions as kind of an example of how we're supposed to behave. And we'll talk a little bit about how these sort of behaviors led to the application for the original readers, and also how they can apply to us today. So without further ado, we can start looking at our presentation. Okay. All right. So we're in Daniel chapter 5, and obviously the title to give to this is The Writing on the Wall. And in the background, you can actually kind of see the Aramaic that was actually written on the wall. And of course, we'll talk about those phrases. And so you can see the many Tekel Upharsin, which the story is going to not only explain for us, but give us the purpose of that particular writing. Okay, so it's just probably best to just read through the passage. It's only 31 verses, and the story is fairly straightforward. And then we can go in and we can talk about the various passages. All right, so let's begin. All right, Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, and concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain this interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, and Chaldeans and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel, who was the one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Now just the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me. I lost my line there. That they might read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler of the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription of the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father, because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him. All the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed, and whomever he wished, he spared alive, and whomever he wished, he elevated, and whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beast, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand are your breath life and your ways, you have not glorified. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Now, this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler of the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. And that's the story. That's the story that we actually have. Okay. So Daniel was awarded, but his reward didn't even last for a whole 24 hours, because on that very night, Babylon was sacked and it was given over to another nation. And that particular king, that Median king, is going to function as the ruler of the next story in Daniel chapter 6. Okay, so we kind of have just a very similar story. Again, the arrogance of a king, some sort of phenomenon, some sort of intervention of God that's meant to punish the arrogance of the king. The people can't understand it. They need Daniel to understand it, even though he's this lowly exile. And the king's behavior is called out for being evil. And because Daniel is faithful, he gets rewarded in the end. But the king actually gets punished. Okay. So again, we have an example of what not to do. We have an example of how we are supposed to act and behave. Okay. So let's go through and let's talk about the particular story. So we got a new character here. Okay. We're not talking about Nebuchadnezzar anymore. So we've got a new king. His name is Belshazzar. Okay. Do not confuse him with the name that was given to Daniel. Daniel's name was Belteshazzar. Okay. But this king is Belshazzar. Okay. We know quite a lot about this particular king from history. In fact, the annals and the historical records that have been left to us from the various Babylonian dynasties are pretty complete. We actually have a lot of information regarding who these people are, when they ruled, who their parents were, who their children were. We have a wealth of information about that. Okay, so he is a historical figure, and what he actually did was that he acted as a regent while his particular father, whose actual name was King Nabonidus, was actually away on business. Okay, this is why I think that in the story it says it's not that Daniel will have a third of the kingdom; it's that Daniel will be the third ruler. Okay, because Belshazzar was actually just kind of occupying the throne as kind of a vice regent, while the real king, who was still alive and still functioning as the king, was actually away on business. So Daniel would actually be the third ruler. Okay, so people are wondering why it says that. I think that's the best historical explanation for that. Okay, so what do we know about Belshazzar? Okay, is he a good king or he's a bad king? Answer: he's a bad king. Okay, and the author introduces Belshazzar as extremely hedonistic and arrogant. Okay, and so you can see right in the first couple of verses, it says, when Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold, silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple, which is in Jerusalem. Why? So that the king and his nobles and his wives and the concubines might drink from them. Okay. So here's a couple of interesting things. First of all, we can see that he is doing this while he is tasting the wine. Okay. I mean, it's as if he is under the influence of alcohol and he's making terrible decisions. Okay. The alcohol is certainly encouraging his own pride. And we can see that he is wanting to debase and to defile the holy vessels that were used in the Jerusalem temple. Now, the way that it's explained is as if, he's the first person to do it. You don't get the impression that Nebuchadnezzar had actually, participated in this banquet, this feast, this drinking of wine and the sharing of wine with 1,000 other persons, using the holy sacred vessels from the Jerusalem temple. Nebuchadnezzar didn't do that. You get the impression that it's only Belshazzar who's doing it. So he's, excuse me, he's sinking to a new low that even Nebuchadnezzar hadn't sunk to. Okay. And Nebuchadnezzar went pretty low. I mean, he got to the point to where he started to exhibit subhuman behavior and started to act like an animal. Okay. So not only is he drunk with wine, not only is he debasing and defiling the instruments belonging to God, but he's encouraging others to participate in that particular activity. All right. So, and that's what I put here. He also, in doing so, he praised the false gods while drinking from them. Okay. So he's committing idolatry, he's drinking the wine and he's, making a toast up to, to the Babylonian gods, to Bel, to Marduk, those sort of things. Okay. So the way that the story goes is that it indicates that the hand basically appeared at the particular moment when Belshazzar was exhibiting this sort of behavior. Okay. it indicates that God is intervening due specifically to the irreverent, sinful actions of Belshazzar. Okay, I mean, the point there is that God strongly disapproves with the defiling of the instruments in the temple. That's going to be very, very important for you to consider. Okay, it's not just that he's drunk. Okay, it's not just that he's holding this feast and he's praising a bunch of other gods. It's the fact that he's defiling the temple and the instruments of the temple in a way that even Nebuchadnezzar hadn't done. So now the interesting thing here is that he starts off by being this extremely prideful and hedonistic person, but boy, that changes very, very quickly. After seeing the hand, it says that his face grew pale. I mean, he shifts his entire his internal posture, and of course the way that it appears. Now, what's really interesting for me is the specific language that was used to describe this. Okay, now there are, you might be interested to know, there are kind of two very prominent Greek translations of the book of Daniel. The first one, the earliest one, comes from the Septuagint. That's important. But there was also a very famous Greek translation from a Jew named Theodotion, and he did his translation in the 2nd century AD. Okay, and when Theodotion saw this phrase, that his face grew pale, he rendered it as the form of the king changed. But the word for form is this noun morphe. And why is this word morphe important? Because it's the word that shows up in Philippians 2, where it says that Jesus was in the form of God, but he emptied himself and he took the form of a servant. Okay, and that's the same sort of language that's being used here to describe a king who formerly was acting in a very arrogant, hedonistic, sinful way, but his form changed. But what that means, it wasn't that, he stopped being a human being and he changed into something else. He was still who he was, but his attitude changed. His posture changed. He went from being arrogant to being completely frightened. Okay, and I think that that's really helpful. When I see that language, I think this is a Jewish translator after Paul had written, Philippians 2, is using the same word to describe a person who stays human, but changes his attitude, his posture, his disposition. And I think that, again, just it helps us to understand the sort of language we see in Philippians 2, to where Jesus, he is a king, but he empties himself of that, and he takes the form, the posture, the attitude of the servant, of a suffering servant. Okay, and actually, there are like 3 places in Daniel 5 to where that sort of language, his face grew pale, but it gets translated as the form of the king changed. Okay, so again, that might be just a little too technical information for you, but if you're aware of the specifics I'm talking about, you're going to find that this is really interesting and really fascinating. Okay, now here's something that I think has actually been lost in translation. Okay, so in describing how this king changes from being arrogant to being basically frightened, it says that his hip joints went slack. Hip joints went slack. Okay, but in Aramaic, it's much more accurate. A much more literal translation is actually his loin belts were loosened. Okay, now you've probably heard the saying in the Bible to gird up your loins, and what that means is basically to kind of to tie up, the clothing, the loose clothing of your robe or of your toga, so that you can actually move and run and do action. Okay, so if you're girding up your loins, means that you're tying those things up so that you can actually run and do things. Here we're actually seeing the opposite. We're seeing that his loin belts were loosened. Now, I don't know about you, but I never wear more than one belt at one time. Okay, so the fact that the word belts is plural is very interesting. And some scholars have suggested that what's actually happening here is a humiliating way of saying that something more than his belt was loosened, because it was his loin that was, the belts of his loin were loosened, And maybe they're actually saying that he lost control of his bowels. Okay. So it's kind of one of those things that it's definitely contrasting the king that, 5 seconds ago was extremely arrogant. And look what happens when God intervenes and he recognizes, what God has actually done. So, there's, I keep being surprised at things in the Bible that might not be very appropriate to read to children. So, for those 5-year-olds watching this, I'm sorry to your parents. Okay. Anyway, it might actually mean that, but for whatever reason, it's the loin of his belts in the plural were loosened, and you have to find a way to figure out what does it mean by the plural belts. Okay, so like many stories that we have already seen, the king calls for the local experts, our experts, to explain the meaning of the phenomenon from Israel's God. But guess what? They are all incompetent for the task. Okay, and I feel like we've seen that. We saw it in chapter 2. We saw it in chapter 4, and then we see it here in chapter 5. Okay, they can't explain what's actually taking place. Okay, I don't know how these people still have jobs. I mean, they can't. They continually can't do what they're called to do. Okay, but of course, Daniel is always the person that's able to come in and explain this. And by now, as the reader, you've come to expect that when the king's going to call in these experts, they're not going to be able to interpret what God has done, but Daniel is going to be able to do so. Of course, it indicates that the empowerment of God upon Daniel makes him much more suitable for the task than these other people. Okay, the God of Daniel is, of course, better than the God or the gods of Babylon, right? And I also think it's very interesting, too, that when it talks about Daniel's ability to interpret all these things, the text goes out of its way to indicate that it's not Daniel as someone who's really, really smart or really, really wise. It's that Daniel is empowered with the Spirit of God that's able to do, like, it gives a whole laundry list of things. So, and again, it's indicating it's the empowerment of God through God's Spirit that's able to interpret all of these, these dreams, these visions, and of course now this writing. Okay, now kind of this unlikely hero enters the scene, and the queen, she doesn't get a lot of press in the story, but I actually think that she has a very interesting role here, and I'll talk about her a little bit in the application. But she enters, and she actually has to remind Belshazzar of Daniel and all that Daniel has already accomplished for Nebuchadnezzar. Something, by the way, that the readers, you already know that Daniel has interacted with Nebuchadnezzar in very similar stories. And it's the queen reminds Belshazzar of this as if it's something that he should know. It's not that she is telling him this as brand new information they didn't already know. She's having to remind him of this. And the fact that that Belshazzar had to be reminded of this further indicates the extent of his incompetency as king. But she had enough sense to learn from the past interventions of Daniel's God, but Daniel is not as wise as she is, okay? So what's interesting about the queen is that there's nothing in the text that says anything negative about the queen. In fact, while the king is out there and he is having his wine and he's getting all these other people involved and he's sharing the wine and everyone else is just kind of going along with the debauchery, they're going along with the sinful, irreverent attitude, nothing negative is said about the queen. She's the only person that's actually able to stand up to the king and to say, hey, you called all these experts, they can't do it. Haven't you learned about Daniel and what he's done? So she's actually kind of portrayed, I think, in a positive light, as like the only positive Chaldean in the story. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so Daniel is summoned, and he's promised several gifts if he can interpret the writing on the wall, all of which he immediately refuses, okay? And I think it's interesting. He refuses it, but they give it to him anyway, and what can he do? He knows it's not going to last very long. Okay, now, when he interprets the writings, he makes some very key points at the beginning, okay? Because he doesn't just start off and say, let me tell you what many, many Tekel Upharsin actually means, okay? He starts off by saying, number one, the Most High God gave sovereignty to Nebuchadnezzar, okay? So lots and lots of gods, but there's one who is greater than all the others. He is the Most High God. And he is the person who gave dominion, kingship, and sovereignty to Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. And it's really important to kind of consider this, is that from a political standpoint, if you were to look at the history, let's just say you were kind of you weren't someone that believed in God, and you were looking at the history of what happened when Babylon came and they conquered the Israelites, and they destroyed the temple, and they exiled all the Israelites, or most of them, to Babylon. Okay. Your assessment would be that Babylon was the much stronger nation militarily, and Israel was defeated. Okay. From the perspective of the Israelites, though, and from the perspective of Daniel, his way of saying that is that the Most High God gave the sovereignty to Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. So you have kind of a theological reason, and you kind of have a historical reason. And I think that's important to see how they were interpreting these events. Okay. All right. The second thing that Daniel tells Belshazzar is that the king did as he wished. Okay. So God empowered Nebuchadnezzar, but Nebuchadnezzar was doing everything that he wanted to do. Okay. And I don't think that's a neutral statement. Okay. Because the king also became very prideful. Number 3. And he was deprived of his throne specifically because of his prideful heart. Okay. All right. So God empowered Nebuchadnezzar with the sovereignty. God saw his pride. God took away his own throne. Okay. What do you think is going to happen to Belshazzar? All right. And then Nebuchadnezzar went from being someone who was empowered by God as a king to losing that kingship. And he sunk down into, again, this subhuman level of living and acting with animalistic behavior. Okay. And this is going to be very, very important for the next couple of chapters, because in the next chapter, we're going to see Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. And the way that you need to read that is, we have a human being is being thrown into the den of animals. Who is going to win? Is it the animals that are going to win, or is it a human being who's going to win? And we have to remember that in Genesis 1, human beings were created to rule over the animals. Okay. If animals are ruling over human beings, something is wrong with God's creation, and God needs to intervene and to restore human beings back to their rightful position. And of course, at the end of that particular story, the human being is vindicated over the animals. And I'm just kind of giving you a preview here. In Daniel chapter 7, we're going to see that there are 4 ferocious animalistic beasts that are harassing a son of man. Who's going to win? The animals or the son of man? Answer: the son of man. Okay, so you can see this sort of language that we already saw it in chapter 4. We're seeing it here. We're reminded of it in chapter 5. We're going to see it again in chapter 6, and we're going to see it again in chapter 7. Okay, and that all recalls this theology from Genesis chapter 1, where human beings were created to rule over the animals. Okay, so if a human being who's supposed to be a ruler gets sunk down to the level and is acting like an animal, then that human being is not functioning in the way that God had created him to be. Okay, that's really, really important. And of course, God's going to take kingship away from that person and give it to someone else. Okay, that's one of the most important theological points of the book of Daniel that just gets missed and overlooked in many readings. All right. All right. So now, after describing the rise and the fall of Nebuchadnezzar's career, Daniel turns and rebukes Belshazzar. Quote, yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. So Daniel points out, like, look, this is not new to you. You knew all of the behavior of Nebuchadnezzar. You knew all these things happened to him. You knew that he was given this dominion. You knew that he acted in a way as he pleased, as he wished, as he willed, okay? And that God took away his dominion because of his prideful heart, and that in doing so, Nebuchadnezzar was kind of debased to a point of no longer acting like a human being. He started acting, as a wild animal, okay? But the rebuke from Daniel indicates something that I think is really important for the story, is that the readers should have also learned from the mistakes of those who came before. Okay. Belshazzar should have learned from the mistakes of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. And what we see is that he's actually being held accountable for not learning the mistakes of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. And the readers, of course, I mean, we've been reading through the story. And I've tried to point this out, like, look, here's a king. He's painted in a bad way. He's painted as a prideful, arrogant person. Don't act that way. Don't act that way. Why? Because the rebuke here, the God-inspired rebuke of Daniel is that you haven't humbled your heart, even though you knew all of these things. Okay. He acted in the same way. He didn't learn from the mistakes of his forebears. Okay. Really important point. Okay. Okay. Furthermore, the king has exalted himself, and actually it's much more literal in the Aramaic here, above the Lord of heaven. Okay. Now my NASB says that he exalted himself against the Lord of heaven. Okay. That's a possible translation, but I think it's much more likely that the preposition there means above in this sense. I mean, he's acting like he's actually better than the Lord of heaven. I mean, he's actually taking the vessels from the temple because he doesn't think that, that Yahweh is a powerful God. I mean, Yahweh was defeated by the gods of Babylon. But Daniel, of course, is informing them that no, God is the one that gave the victory to Nebuchadnezzar, not due to Nebuchadnezzar's own power and might and military strength. So the gods of the king, the gods that the king did openly acknowledge, Daniel notes, they can't hear, they can't see, and they can't even understand what's going on here. Okay. So your gods, they're nothing. They can't see what's going on. They can't hear anything that you're saying. They certainly don't understand what's actually taking place. However, okay, Belshazzar should have been giving glory to the God, specifically the God who actually gives life, who gives breath. Okay. So you've got the true God is the one that actually is the creator. He gives you the ability to live, the ability to breathe. Okay. And Belshazzar should have given glory to God. But instead, he's been defiling God and debasing God and insulting God and, praising and, having a feast, a drunken feast in celebration of other gods that aren't even real. Okay. So there's no doubt that the narrator is painting Belshazzar as guilty, 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 guilty. I mean, he's, no sign of remorse, no sign of repentance, nothing like that. So, okay, after taking all of that time, remember, Daniel's been called in to interpret. Before he interprets, he lets the king have it. He lets the king have it. He's like, look, you should have learned your lesson. This is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. You're doing the same thing. In fact, you're doing many of these things that are worse. And you're guilty, you're guilty, you're guilty. Okay. So then he goes on. He's like, all right, now I'm going to explain this stuff to you. Okay. All right. So most readers can't read Aramaic, so they're just, the English is going to do the best they can with this. But so we have these words, many, many, tickle, upharsin, and they're kind of vocalized as nouns in verse 25, but when they're explained in verses 26 to 28, they're actually puns on acts of judgment. Okay. And it's really impossible to bring the sense of the pun out into English. So I'm going to do the best that I can to explain that for you. Okay. So what is a mini? Okay. It's actually a unit of weight. It's 1/16 of a talent. Okay. Maybe you're familiar with the parable of the talents in Luke chapter 19, although I think it's Matthew 25 that his version is the parable of the talents. In Luke 19 is the parable of the minas. Okay. But the pun verb mana, you can hear kind of mana as a pun of many. The verb mana means to number. Okay. And so you can see how it shows up in 526. God has numbered your kingdom and put it into it. So he goes, here's the word many. God has numbered. Okay. Because that's because the verb to number is a pun on the noun for a unit of weight. Okay. All right. So, but sorry, I'll go back. You can see there that these are the puns are acts of judgment. Okay. God has numbered your kingdom and he's put an end to it. Okay. All right. That's what he's done there. He's weighed it, he's numbered it, and he's found that it's lacking, and he's going to put an end to it. Okay. God, notice here, God, who is known as the God that's going to judge the world on the future day of judgment, can still intervene in the middle of history and enact judgment when the opportunity arises. Okay. Tekel is a unit of money. It's actually 1/16 of a mina. So you'll kind of notice that as we move through here, the amounts are getting smaller. Okay, so if a mina, if a mini is there, and tekel is 1/16 of a mina, where they're moving into smaller and smaller amounts. Okay, the pun verb to call, you can hear the T and the K and the L in that verb, with the T and the K and the L of the noun tekel. Okay, that verb means to weigh. And what does the English say? You have been weighed, there's the pun verb, on the scales, and you've been found deficient. Okay, well, who has done that? Well, God, of course, has done that. Okay. All right. And then we have this word eupharsin. Okay, and you should know that the U in front of it there is it's not part of the noun. That's just the conjunction and. So it's like and this. Okay, so you have kind of this word. It's not just eupharsin, it's just farsin. Okay, what is that? It's a half mina. Okay, but the pun verb paras, and you can hear the P and the R and the S in that verb, with the P and the R and the S in the word in the noun farsin. And this is really important because this actually doesn't get as accurately conveyed in the translation as it should. The verb paras means to be divided into two parts. Okay, it means to be. It's not just like kind of cut or divided. Like I can, when we talk about our division tables, you could divide a number into any number of numbers. Okay, but this particular verb means to divide into two. Very important. Okay, because we see here that the explanation is that your kingdom has been divided. There's the pun, and given over into two different nations, to the Medes and to the Persians. Okay, or this is in two separate recipients. Okay, because we're going to see that at the end of this chapter, it's given over to the Median kingdom, and then at the end of the next chapter, it's going to be given over to the Persian Empire. Okay, so it's given over to two different nations. Okay, not to one nation that's actually two Medes and Persians together. It's divided into two, given to two other recipients. Okay, so the writing on the wall basically indicates that Belshazzar's behavior has brought about the judgment of God. After revealing the meaning of the writing on the wall, Daniel is nevertheless awarded for his efforts, but by the end of the night, Belshazzar is killed, and we're not actually told by whom. Was he killed by God? Was he killed by the Median army that came in and conquered conquered the Babylonians? What's actually interesting here, and I thought about putting a slide in here, but I thought it might kind of derail us a little bit, is that we actually have we've got two different ancient historians that indicates that Babylon fell during a time when they were having a celebratory feast. Like that particular element of the story was remembered by historians. Like, it wasn't that, they were being besieged, during a time of war. It's that they were caught unaware because they were celebrating and they were having a feast. And that particular detail was remembered by at least two different ancient historians. I'm not talking about like ancient people, like Herodotus, who was a Greek writing historian that told us a lot about ancient Babylon. Anyway, so we don't know by whom. The text doesn't tell us, but clearly it's God is the one that allowed it. Now, the next king to come into power, according to the narrative of Daniel, is from the kingdom of Media. Okay, so it actually says, so Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Why does it tell us about the age of 62? I don't know. I don't know what the relevance of that is. There are a lot of Jews that said, well, if we can take the time when he took over the nation of Babylon, and we subtract his age. We could probably figure out when Babylon actually destroyed Jerusalem. And so, some of the rabbis just kind of speculate. They said, well, maybe God allowed this Darius figure to be born at the very time when Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem as kind of God's vengeance for that. I think that's a stretch. The text doesn't explicitly say that, but you can see it's how it is with the Bible. You have a detail in there. The detail doesn't seem to have any real significant purpose. People will say, well, what does that mean? And it gives people an opportunity to speculate. Okay. So that was just a speculative suggestion by some of the Jewish rabbis many, many years later. Okay. Now, by having the kingship shift from Babylon to Media, the interpretation of the four-tiered statue, as I argued in Daniel chapter 2, where we have Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece, is actually confirmed. Okay. Because it's not passed to Media Persia. It's passed to a king from Media. He's Darius the Mede. Okay. For many of you, none of this really matters, but because this is an ongoing debate with interpreters, I have to continue to make the point that other chapters in Daniel support that particular reading of Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. Okay. So, all right. Before we take the time to ask, how does this apply to us in our lives? As I've done with all these chapters, I want to ask, what would this have meant to the original readers, namely those original readers who were in the midst of the Maccabean revolt, where they had a very arrogant king who decided he was going to go, or maybe not personally, but to send his forces into the Jerusalem temple to set up an altar to Zeus, to forbid the observance of the Jewish law, and to desecrate the temple in that particular way. Okay, so how would those people experiencing those events, how would they have read the book of Daniel and thought about the ways to apply the message of Daniel to their own experience? So, what we're going to read is just a little passage here from First Maccabees, and you can kind of get a sense at the way that they actually behaved in history. Remember, First Maccabees was written slightly after Daniel, but it indicates the sort of behavior that these people demonstrated in light of what they learned from Daniel chapter 5. Okay. All right. So then Judas and his brothers, this is Judas Maccabeus, by the way, said, "See, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." So all the army assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. Okay, bad news. Okay, in the courts they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket, or as on one of the mountains. Okay, so you got you've got stuff growing there, like in or around the temple. Okay, they also saw the chambers of the priest in ruins, and they tore their clothes and they mourned with great lamentation. They sprinkled themselves with ashes and fell face down on the ground. And when the signal was given with the trumpets, they cried out to heaven. Another way of saying they cried out to God. Then Judas detailed men to fight against those in the citadel until it had been cleansed. Until he had cleansed the sanctuary. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offerings, which had been profaned. Okay, and they thought it best to tear it down so that it would not be a lasting shame to them that the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar and they stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill. Notice this interesting detail here. Until a prophet should come and tell them what to do with them. That's interesting. It shows that this prophet figure is someone that they're waiting. They're waiting for a prophet to come to tell them how to, operate their own temple. Okay. And I think this is the prophet from Deuteronomy 18, the prophet from Moses, the prophet from among your people who's going to come, and God's going to put his own words into the mouth of this particular prophet. And Jesus, of course, shows up and functions as that prophet. So it's interesting that there's this expectation that we're waiting for the prophet to come and tell us what to do. Okay. All right. So then they took the unhewn stones
as the law directs. They built a new altar on the former one. They also rebuilt the sanctuary in the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. And here's the interesting thing. They made new holy vessels and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. Okay, so in the 2nd century BC, when the forces of the Greek king Antiochus IV had desecrated the temple and put up an altar of Zeus on there, when the temple was to be rededicated, they felt that anything that was defiled had to go. Okay, it's not that, well, it's defiled and we're just going to clean it, wash it off, and we're just going to reuse it. They thought, no, if it's been defiled, we're going to get rid of it. We're going to make new stuff and we're going to put it in there. But particularly we have the holy vessels, the very things that in our story of Daniel chapter 5 were this. I think that was the catalyst to God intervening. It wasn't that Belshazzar was drunk. It wasn't that he was talking to other gods. It was that he took the holy vessels, he drank wine out of them, and he dedicated that drunken banquet to pagan gods. And so the people that basically kind of won in the Maccabean revolt, when they were cleansing the temple, they said, if the vessels have been debased and defiled, we're going to get new vessels, okay, because they have to remain holy. All right, so I think that's kind of an interesting point. Why did they do that? Probably because of what they read in Daniel chapter 5. Okay, now if you have like study notes in your Bible, you're probably going to come across some little issues here regarding some issues with historicity with Daniel chapter 5. Okay, so I kind of felt like, should I say something about this? Should I not say something about this? I felt if I didn't say something about it, then someone's just going to ask a question about it, and I need to give an answer to it. So I thought let's just kind of settle this thing right here. When we try to situate Daniel chapter 5 into history, historians have some problems doing so. Okay, and I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to try to hide any of this from you. I'm just going to be honest with you and say that, yeah, we have some difficulties with it. I'm going to show you how people have tried to solve those particular difficulties. So historians who are, excuse me, historians who are, sorry, historians partial to Christianity have struggled to harmonize the details of Daniel chapter 5 with what we know about history of that time period, leading most scholars who specialize in the book of Daniel to argue that this chapter should be understood as a theological story rather than a historical story, okay? And we should read it theologically, and perhaps that the story was written to be understood theologically rather than a historical story. What reasons are given for that? So we are constantly told in the story that the son of Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar, and Belshazzar's father was Nebuchadnezzar. That's just not the case. That's just not true. The son of Nebuchadnezzar was not Belshazzar. It was a guy named Emil-Marduk, who was actually known by another name, Evil-Merodach, according to 2 Kings 25:27. So like the Bible tells us who Nebuchadnezzar's son actually was, but it wasn't Belshazzar. After this guy, his brother-in-law was a guy named Nergal-Sharezer. He ruled, followed by his own son, Labushi-Marduk. And then we have a different king, Nabonidus, and his son was Belshazzar. So we have a variety. So there's a lot of smaller rulers between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. So in short, Belshazzar's father was not Nebuchadnezzar, and they weren't even related in a bloodline. Okay, these are like actually 3 different families. So I don't know how to harmonize that. I'm just telling you, I'm struggling with that. It just, I don't know what to do with that information there. And we kind of alluded to this earlier. Belshazzar was never actually a king because his father Nabonidus was actually alive and well, and Nabonidus went off to go on business, leaving Belshazzar as an acting regent. But throughout the story, he's kind of called Belshazzar the king. But people point out and say, well, he actually never was an actual king. He just kind of was ruling in his father's place. His father was the real king. While the historical records of those who ruled during this period are extensive and very thorough, we don't actually have any surviving data concerning a figure named Darius the Mede. Like, nobody knows who this guy is. We have like no evidence for him. No one talks about him. No historical records mention a Median person named Darius. So like those are just historical things that have been brought up. And again, the way that the scholars have answered it is to say we need to read Daniel theologically, not as a historical document. Okay, maybe there are answers for these sort of things. I don't know what those answers are, but I'm pointing them out to you because if you have a Bible with study notes, they're going to say these things to you. Okay, and so my point, though, I think again, where it actually really matters, where any of this really matters, is that the applications of the story are not actually affected by the results of any of these. Okay, how you apply the story to your life is not affected by anything in this particular slide. Okay, but I just kind of feel like as a teacher, I need to tell you the truth about the text. I need to tell you what's going on here. Okay, let's move to the application. Again, this is probably the most important thing. This needs to be modern applications from Daniel chapter 5, not Daniel chapter 4. I did not proofread this very well. So Daniel chapter 5, I'll fix this. All right. So I make mistakes. All right. Number 1, the rise and fall of various rulers within the book of Daniel remind us that we only have our current roles in life because the Creator has graciously chosen to give them to us. So as the people of God, our faithful response towards his gracious initiative must include the giving of thanks, praise, and humility. The text constantly points out that Nebuchadnezzar was in his position because God gave the sovereignty to him. Okay. The implication, too, is that Belshazzar is in his position only because God allowed it. Okay. We only have wherever we are, our jobs, our positions in our households, in our communities, in our marriages, whatever they may be. We only have those things because God gave them to us. Okay. It's not based on our own might or our own intelligence or our own hard work. Okay. All of those things are things that God has empowered us to do and to perform. And so because God has given those things to us, our response, our covenant response, is to respond faithfully by showing thanksgiving, by the offering of praise, and by demonstrating humility. Okay. Notice these are all the things that Belshazzar should have done, but he didn't do. So again, we're learning from his mistakes, and we're obviously doing what we should do. Okay. Number 2, the rebuke that Daniel brings to Belshazzar includes the notion that he should have learned from the mistakes of those who came before him. In other words, Belshazzar should have learned from the mistakes of Nebuchadnezzar. So how do we apply this to our lives? Well, we too must take care to understand the sort of sinful behavior God dislikes, and as a community, we must strive to avoid repeating it. Okay. If Belshazzar should have learned from the mistakes of Nebuchadnezzar, then obviously we need to learn from the mistakes of other people who have sinned. Okay. And it's implied here that Belshazzar is being held accountable for not learning from the mistakes of Nebuchadnezzar. Do you think we're going to be treated any differently? I mean, we're reading the entire story. Okay. So I think we need to, really, as a community, really seek to not only understand how to be faithful to God and things that we're supposed to do, but also faithfulness implies turning away from the things that God despises, the things that God hates, the sinful behavior that clearly God has punished over and over and over throughout, the biblical period. Okay. So, and this is not a personal thing. I mean, this is something we have to do as a community, as a community of believers, as the church. We got to understand what sort of things God dislikes, and we need to strive through obedience, through prayer, through the empowerment of the Spirit to avoid repeating those same mistakes. I think that's obvious. Okay. Number 3, Daniel's courage to point out the ways in which the king was falling short of his responsibilities serves as an example for the readers to follow. And as future rulers of the world, as future rulers in God's kingdom, let us pray for the courage, the words to speak, and the wisdom needed to promote the reign of God in the present. Okay? We need to, have the courage, the things to say, and even the wisdom to know when to say them and how to put the words into actions as we function as the kingdom people today, as we, enact the reign of God. If we, through our own obedience and behavior, through the empowerment of the Spirit and our obedience to Jesus as the church being the light to the world, as we demonstrate the reign of God on earth as it is in heaven. If we can be the kingdom people now, we demonstrate what it's going to be like when we're going to be ruling the world in the future. Okay. And Daniel had the courage to point out to his king how he was falling short of his royal responsibilities. And you know what? We need to pray to have the courage, the wisdom, and the words to do the same when the opportunity arises. And we do that not just to follow his example, but because we're kingdom people. Okay, we know what it's like to be a good ruler because we have Jesus as our example. We know that we're aiming to do that when Jesus returns, and that in some sense we are experiencing and participating in the reign of God in the present. We have to be the kingdom people right now as we are training for reigning and we're schooling for future ruling. And lastly, in a culture where talking back to an arrogant king could lead to your death, the queen nevertheless stands out as the only sensible Chaldean in the entire story. And her example reminds us that we should do and say the right thing, even if everyone else in the room is participating in the evil that is taking place. I think that's kind of like the application that I'm drawing from her. She was the only person that was willing to stand up to the king and say, what you're doing is wrong. You haven't learned your lesson. You haven't learned from Nebuchadnezzar. And she's willing to kind of at least speak up and to say the right thing, even, which is kind of a dangerous thing to do. She's willing to say the right thing when everyone else is just kind of going along with the sinful behavior. And you know what? I mean, we have example. I mean, look at John the Baptist. He spoke up to a king and he said, you should not be doing this sort of behavior. He's willing to stand up and say and do the right thing. And he actually got punished for it. He actually got beheaded. And there are many times when Jesus would rebuke the authorities. He was willing to stand up and to say and do the right thing, even when other people around him weren't willing to do so. Okay. And so I think we could draw kind of ironically from her example as being the only person to stand up and to say and do what is right when everyone else is doing what is wrong. And it's kind of funny. We teach this to little kids, but I think adults need to be encouraged to do this as well. And she's not the only example. I pointed out we have John the Baptist and Jesus as examples as well. Okay. All right. So that's our teaching on Daniel chapter 5. I'm going to stop the recording here. Thank you so much for watching. Sure to check out the information in the description of the video if you want to get in contact with us, if you want to join us for Biblical Unitarian Fellowship. We would love to have you. We would love to be here and have you share your giftings and your calling with us as we grow as the body of Christ, as a kingdom people today. Thanks for watching and take care.